So Joe, we're here today celebrating 20 years on this site for your tasting room. And one of the things that's always fascinated me about this event and thinking about it is that Ravenswood obviously has been around longer than 20 years. So tell us a little bit about the years previous to 20 years ago. Where were you in terms of a tasting room and in terms of Ravenswood previously from those 20 years?
Well, we started the winery in 1976, and I was working as an immunology research guy and didn't have a lot of money. Had grown up loving wine and had learned a lot about wine early. Was living in Berkeley, was kind of a shakiness addict, was interested in food, was doing wine tastings. But I ran into a guy named Joseph Swan who was willing to teach me how to make wine. So from 72 into 76, I worked with him, and I made my first wine at Joe's Winery. And every year after that, I had to find a different winery to make wine at. Not because I was a particularly miserable guy to work with, but it seemed that every time I got involved with somebody, they were also expanding, and they just didn't have room to keep me. So the first year I was at Joe Swan's Winery. The second year I used space at Northwest Winery. The third year I went to Martini and Prati, which was a gigantic crushing station for Gallo. Stayed there for a couple of years, and then I went to Topolis at Russian River Vineyard and shared space with him for a couple of years. So, in fact, one wine writer referred to me as the peripatetic winery. Sent me to my Funk and Wagnalls right away. Oh, what's that mean? It means nomadic, which is true, because it could never find.
Right.
And then in 1981, we moved down to Sonoma, and we took over a rustic tin building, which I used to love to refer to as the gourmet toilet seat shop, because the people who were there before I arrived ran a woodworking shop, and they made oak toilet seats. So it just goes to show you can make wine anywhere if you're really desperate.
Right.
Let's just say that none of those places were places that I could have a tasting room or even would kind of invite people to. People came, but, it was like the bachelor pad in my toilet seat winery. There was cat hair around, we had a big old yellow cat, and there was paper. And in fact, I didn't actually have any employees until shortly after 1981. My first employee was a lady named Lynn Rogers, who was was the last person in the world, I think, that could do stenography. She was like an amazing, like over-the-top, capable person who basically turned my life upside down. She basically became kind of the work wife. She cleaned up the cat hair, the papers went away, the glasses we had were clean, so suddenly I could actually have people there. But it wasn't like anybody could find us. The county wouldn't let us have a sign, so nobody really knew where we were, so they had to really find us. But we grew, and we managed to develop more cash flow, and so by 1991, we were actually able to afford this place, which was originally the Benson Winery, and then it became the Haywood Winery, and then when Peter sold it, he sold it to us. So we were very fortunate to get it. And when we got it, we then modified the tasting room for a while, because it got ridiculous. When people found out they could actually come and taste Ravenswood wines, they would show up in droves. And we would have, like people standing in what was our little box of the tasting room all the way out, and they'd pass their the credit card over to them. I want a case of Old Hill Ranch Zinfandel. We'd pass them back the case of Old Hill Ranch and their credit card, and they'd sign it, and they'd send it back up. Right. So we expanded the tasting room. So we moved around a lot. For that, and we grew. We were a very small winery that was started out specializing in Zinfandel at a time when people drank white wine 4-to-1 over red, and I always think I'm very fortunate to have had the French, around, because, I started my winery in 1976, which is, of course, the year of the Judgment of Paris.
Exactly.
The French were very nicely said that California wines were every bit as good as theirs. Thank you very much. And that didn't hurt us a bit. And then we also had the French paradox, another one of those French things, in which it was noted that the French who ate vast quantities of fat had very low incidence of heart disease, and that was probably because they drank red wine. And that has stood up over the test of time. So since I was an all red wine winery, and was stubbornly sticking to that, I was very fortunate. I ended up in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and it's funny because there's things about a brand, you know you're successful and you're synonymous with the product that you're working with. And in many cases, to many people, if you say Ravenswood, they're going to say Zinfandel. And I'm just interested in how you came across to be working with Zinfandel. And I was also going to ask you about Joseph Swan, because I know that he was very influential when you were starting in the business. So how did that all come together?
Well, I ran into Joe at a tasting, and we hit it off quite well, and I found out that he was really developing this small winery. He was still very much in the development phase of his winery when I met him.
This is in the Russian River area.
In the Russian River,
right?
Trenton, Forestville area.
Exactly, yeah.
He was beginning to build his own building. I had some skills, so I volunteered to help him, and we talked a lot about wine and things like that. And so he basically taught me the nuts and bolts of winemaking. I learned how to prune a vine, learned which side of the barrel was up, and learned how to drag a hose from point A to point B. Now there was an added benefit that I hadn't calculated into my my arithmetic when I got involved with Joe. Joe was very good friends with Andre Chelicek, and Andre was advising him. So I got really good advice from Andre as well. Now Joe made Zinfandel, and we all know he made great Zinfandel. And
Absolutely.
His 1968 Zinfandel was legendary. When I tasted it in 1972, I went, "Wow, this is Zinfandel. This is fantastic." And
is that where the light went on for you?
Well, no, it actually had gone on a little earlier than that.
Okay.
But this was just like proof. It was like this was the proof that you could make great wine out of Zinfandel. And he made really interesting wines in 72 and 73, 74 when he was using the Taldeschi grapes. They were just remarkable, really interesting wines. So I was involved with all of those wines. But I had originally began looking at Zinfandel. Joe wanted to be Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Zinfandel was his practice wine, actually. And it turned out to be a wine that he got known for, in spite of his best endeavors to become known as for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Right.
When I began investigating Zinfandel early, I had tasted some that were quite old. And, in fact, Mondavi was doing, Zinfandel in 1966 and using which has just begun the whole sort of modern era of winemaking. And so you tasted some of those wines, and I tasted wines from the 30s that were, pretty terrific. A Larkmead 33 Burgundy, which was Zinfandel Petit Syrah wine, which was really interesting. But those wines were remarkable. But if you looked, and I'd grown up drinking European wines, and I said, well, what in California has the most European affect? And we were planting a lot of vines in those days that were, wide spacing, big trellisings like GDC, drip irrigated, frequently planted in flat areas. Typically places that you wouldn't think would grow great grapes if you were a European. And so what do European vineyards have in common? Well, they have some kind of special soil. They usually have some kind of special pruning system which is appropriate for the area. They have a crop level which is specified usually at 2.5 tons an acre or so. They get a lot of light and air into their grapes. And the vineyard has chosen for the site, that particular grape. The only grapes in California that fit the bill were old vine Zinfandel vineyards. Because they were old, they were low production, usually in that 2 to 2.5 ton an acre site. They were dry farmed like European vines. They had Goblet style trellising, or bush vines, or head trim, which were the same thing. And that carried the fruit around in a way that it got lots of light and air and didn't rot. It was perfect for the larger cluster size of things like Petit Syrah and Zinfandel, and Carignan, which are the three grapes that were involved in these vineyards. And they had been there for so long. The good vines were the ones that survived. The bad vines were the ones that had gotten taken out. So there was almost like a natural selection that took place. And these vines had to work their way through Prohibition. So it really had a chance of making a wine that was really special, really interesting, and uniquely Californian. There was no place else in the world where this kind of combination of grapes. Zinfandel, obviously, is the core grape for that combination, but the other big three are Petit Syrah, Carignan, and Alicante Bouschet. There are other grapes that slip into these mixed black field blends, but it's a California original. It's as original as Bordeaux, Cabernet Merlot, Cabernet Franc is, as the 14 grapes that go in Chateauneuf de Pape are, as Chianti is with its splendid grapes. Grapes chosen by the people of that region to make the wine of that region which suited them the best. And so it's a unique, special wine. So for me, I wanted to make one. And so I set out to do that. Unfortunately, my first attempts, though small, were successful, and people responded very well, to the wines. And, that kept me going.
Sure.
Kept me encouraged.
Absolutely. Let's taste some wine.
Absolutely.
What do you have here today?
Well, I brought two wines that I thought would be interesting. One of them is the Big River Zinfandel. And Big River Zinfandel is truly Zinfandel.
And the location of this vineyard?
This vineyard is on the southern end of Alexander Valley. It is due east of Healdsburg, right along the Russian River. So as the Russian River comes out of Alexander Valley, it breaks into the hills. It gets a little confused. It tries to go to the east, which obviously is not going to work for it. It goes a little south, and then winds all the way back to the north, and then it comes back sort of to the south and then to the west and out into the Russian River.
Right.
This vineyard sits up on this little plateau right at the top of that little peninsula that looks like Florida. And it's in Manzanita series soil, so it's bright red soil. It's really classic Alexander Valley soils. It's just really right on the border of Alexander Valley and Russian River Valley. Right. So it gets a little bit of the coolness, but it also gets the wind. And this is a unique vineyard because it is 100% Zinfandel. And almost old vineyards have other grape varieties in it, but this is 100% Zinfandel, so it is the taste of true Zinfandel. And what you find out about pure Zinfandel when it's grown in these old vineyards is that it's almost Burgundian. It tends to be, has really kind of soft, spicy fruit, maybe a little bit of sagey quality. There's some raspberries in there.
It's definitely a very approachable wine. And 100% Zinfandel.
100% Zinfandel.
Okay.
But it's not aggressive. And sometimes you think of Zinfandels as being big and jammy.
Right.
And being dense and structured. Well, it turns out the nature of the Zinfandel grape is not that. The nature of the Zinfandel grape is much more delicate and actually has a lot of really interesting high-tone complexities and flavors. It's the other grapes that bring a different character to it. So this vineyard was planted in 1900.
And actually, before we move on to the next wine, real quick, the vinification of this wine, anything specific that you can share with us?
These are classic vinifications. These are the way I've been making wine since 1976, or the way I made it with Joe Swan. Open top fermenters, punched down by hand, small volumes. Fermenters are not bigger than 6 tons. Native yeast fermentations.
Native yeast.
All.
So you take those chances.
I don't see it as a chance. I actually have fewer problems with my native yeast fermentations than my friends who inoculate do. Actually.
No stuck fermentations.
Every once in a while, but everybody has them. I mean, usually it's because you've miscalculated the sugar that you're getting out of the field. So, but for the most part, no, we're very good. I've actually done community comparisons, if you will. I've gone around just in any given year and talked to my neighbors and how many stuck fermentations did you have this year? And there are years that have more stuck fermentations just by the nature of them. But we're always on the lower end of that number of stuck fermentations, so we do fine.
I'll tell you, the payoff is awesome. I mean, using the native yeast, the payoff is awesome.
Well, you get a much more complex flavor. You also get a uniqueness in that particular year associated with that particular vineyard. We've done some studies. There are about 30 different yeasts from the variations of Saccharomyces, which are the yeast you want, in a native yeast fermentation. Through the period of the fermentation, there are probably 3 to 4 of them that dominate at any given time. There's one that dominates early, usually one that dominates in the center, one that dominates towards the end. But that's because of the changing conditions of the must. So you have a lot of sugar at the beginning and a lot of alcohol at the end, so it stands to reason that the same yeast is not going to be performing highly at both ends of that spectrum. So, and you get all those yeasts kind of pumping out their flavor characteristics. So you get a much more complex melange in a native yeast wine. So interesting.
Wonderful.
And also all aged in French oak. You stay in French oak for 18 months, which is a relatively long time.
Actually, it is for Zinfandel.
For Zinfandel, it's part of my more traditional winemaking, and and we treat it as little as we possibly can at the end. I'm a great believer in making sure that people get what I put in the bottle. And in fact, in most cases, we don't have to do anything. But you know, if I have a wine that looks like it's going to be sick or has a potential to change in the bottle, will I filter it? Yeah. And will I fine it if I have to? Absolutely. Yeah. But those things are done by necessity, not as a routine or a standard. They're done based on the wine, which is like everything else about this winemaking process, is that it's done based on the need of a particular vineyard in a particular field. You know, these two wines are made, you know, the same way. The Old Hill Ranch we're going to taste now is made the same way as the Big River. The idea here is to give you the character of the place, the typicity of the place, if you will. Some people call it terroir, but I think typicity is almost a better word because terroir implies soil. Well, yeah, the soil has something to do with that, but the vine mix has to do with it. You know, the way the vines are propagated, who propagates them, how much they care for them, what else they let grow in the vineyard, how many deer they have in the vineyard. Those things all change the character of a vineyard. But vineyards have typicity. You know, Big River will always taste like Big River. Old Hill will always taste like Old Hill, and Dickerson will always taste like Dickerson. So the point of the winemaking here is to emphasize the character of a place, not the highfalutin capacity of the winemaker. You know, my highfalutin capacity is to be sure that the wines taste like where they came from, and they have the typicity that I'm looking for in that particular.
It's basically a babysitting job.
It's a babysitting job. Yeah, which is fine. It's a very happy baby.
Right.
So
tell us about this one.
This is Old Hill Ranch. This is one of the oldest vineyards in California. Probably
on the nose, a little bigger.
Yeah, a little bigger, a little spicier.
Yeah.
And that's because this vineyard has got a full complement of mixed blacks in it. It's Zinfandel.
But this may have some stray varieties in it, you're saying?
Oh, yeah. Well, this one's, stray varieties it has.
This like a field blend.
Yeah. When you know the history of this vineyard, it suddenly makes sense. This vineyard was originally planted in about 1862 by a guy named William McPherson Hill. McPherson Hill believed in Iberian varieties. He didn't know what he wanted to plant, nor did anybody else in those years, so they tried the stuff. And this vineyard is a throwback, it's a fragment of his original vineyard, replanted in about 1885 to 1888, which is when he and George Hurst got rootstock from Eugene Hilgard, who was the horticulturist at UC, who was friends with George Hussman, who was the guy who brought rootstock into France. He was in Missouri. So there's this kind of long chain of connection. But the point is that these vines were among the first planted on rootstock in California, and it was a sort of a carryover of his vineyard. So this vineyard has at least 20 different grape varieties in it. We go through the vineyard. It's as planted, it's 51% Zinfandel. So we go through and pick all the Zinfandel first. And then we go through and pick all the mixed blacks, probably 2 weeks later. And so we make 2 wines. So we make one out of the sort of mixed set of grapes, and we make one out of Zinfandel, and then we blend back to make the best wine we can make. It's almost always 25% mixed blacks. So it's a really cool wine. So you can see what the mixed blacks bring this wine. They bring a density, they bring a strength. You know, they take away from the delicacy that was associated with the Big River. Right. But they also bring pepper and spice and almost a minty quality. Yeah, there's a significant amount of Grenache actually in this vineyard. It's about, of the mixed blacks, there's probably almost 10% Grenache.
A lot more spice.
And you can see how all that added pigment that comes out of things like the Petite Syrah and some of the other grapes adds to the density and the sweetness of the center, because all those polyphenolics link up with the tannins and they create this sort of soft, sweet sort of center to the wine. So the wine is not quite as linear as this one. It's not quite as bell-tone clear, but it's got a real richness, to it. Yeah. And this wine actually ages very well. I can pull out bottles of 84 and 85 that I made. They're still still very good.
Because typically Zinfandel is best drunk fresh within the first 3 years or so.
Depends on who makes it.
Okay.
A lot of Zinfandel is carries its heritage of a jug wine with it.
Mm-hmm.
It got relegated to that after Prohibition. Before Prohibition, it made some of the best wines we made in California that were very authentic, really interesting wines. But but it became the kind of the table wine of California, which is why we rebuilt the California wine business on Cabernet and Merlot and Chardonnay, because we didn't believe that anybody would ever take Zinfandel seriously, because it had been a jug wine. So wines that were made in the early days, the early days of the new era, if you will, meaning the 1960s, early 1970s, and even now, frequently were wines that relied on the natural propensity of Zinfandel to be very fruity and jammy. So you taste some of the wines out of Lodi now; they tend to be big and jammy and soft, and it's a good place for making wines like that. But if you have the right terroirs, and you have the right winemaker, and you have the right sort of production of grapes, you can make wines that are the same as any great wine region of the world in terms of their aging capacity. And I've tasted some very old Zinfandels that are as good as any old Bordeaux I've ever tasted. And I've had the good fortune to taste some pretty lovely old Bordeaux. As George Husband said, they're like angels' visits. They're few and far between. But when you get one, it's an angel's visit for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So earlier when we were getting ready to chat, you brought out these bottles, and you must have brought them out for a purpose. So tell us a little bit about what you had in mind when you brought these out.
Well, I did, because it's about the way the wine business works.
Okay.
When I started making single vineyard wines. I was going to be a geeky little winery that only made single vineyard designated wines in the highest fashion possible. And so I did, and I was successful at that. But when you're making these single vineyard wines, there are always lots within the single vineyards that don't make the cut. So you got this little winery, and you say, what am I going to do with this extra wine? You say, well, I'm just going to put it all together in a big vat, and I'm going to do it. And since I was making Sonoma County, that became kind of a blend of Sonoma County vineyards, and you're always trying new vineyards. Some of them, while they're very good, are not good enough or unique enough to make a single vineyard wine. But they make pretty good wine, and they're yours now that you've actually been trying them. So they go into that too. So you end up with a mid-tier wine, like Sonoma County Old Wine Zinfandel. And that becomes kind of your house standard, because it's very difficult for a small winery, at least when I was starting. These days it's much easier because people have the internet and they sell directly and they get paid for their wine very rapidly. But my receivables were 180 to 200 days. It was ridiculous. So I didn't get paid for what I did for a very long time.
Right.
So you needed a wine that people would buy more rapidly and probably pay for more rapidly, because it would turn more rapidly because it was less expensive. So that was Sonoma County Old Wine. That became the flagship for the winery. But even that wasn't quite enough. In 1983, one of my partners came to me and said, you're making great wine. You're getting great scores. You're selling everything you're making, and we're going broke. You need a cash flow wine. I suggest you make one Zinfandel. And I said, I'm sorry. I don't do pink. I don't do sweet. Don't do wimpy. It's not going to happen.
Right.
And he said, well, you better think of something, because if you don't, we won't be here in a year. And
the reality of business.
The reality of business. The wine business is an art. It's a science, but it's also a business. I mean, if you want to make wine, you have to sell it. I can't drink all I make. So just at the end of the day, it just doesn't.
Nor do you have that many friends.
Yeah, that's true. But I wish I did. So I said, well, what can I do that I can actually respect myself? Well, can I make an inexpensive wine that will sell for a reasonable price that I can get out of the winery in less than a year? And so I came up with a red wine that could do that. And that was this wine. That was Vintner's Blend Zinfandel.
Okay.
And Vintner's Blend Zinfandel, I thought, was going to be a small to medium-sized project. So I made 1,000 cases of it in the first go-round, and it sold out instantaneously. And I thought, wow, that's really strange. And then I said, okay, well, I'll make 3,000 cases. That's a lot. And it was gone in almost the same amount of time that the 1,000 cases was. Well, today, this is one of the most consumed Zinfandels in the world. It's the right price. It tastes good. It's made with native yeast, just like I do everything else. It's made with French oak, just like I do everything else. It has all the hallmarks of a really good wine. And people like it. I mean,
and I'm sure the price is right.
Oh, well, the price is under $10.
Right.
So
right.
So at the end of the day, if you make good wine and you price it reasonably, you know, they will come. People drink good wine, and so it's become very popular, and it's the kind of thing that allows me to do these other ones. You know, so it's all kind of a piece, and it's all Zinfandel, and it's quite remarkable. I have to say that I've lived a rather blessed life from that standpoint.
Exactly.
So zinning worked very well for me.
and one last thing before we wrap it up, the No Wimpy Wines thing. Where did that come from? Who's responsible for that?
Well, it kind of came out organically. You remember I told my partner that I wouldn't do Pink, Sweet, or Wimpy.
Right.
And he, you know, he's a really interesting, smart man. He was a Harvard Business School graduate, and you know, and in those days we literally would go into every account and sell the wine. And he walked into the California wine merchant down in Chestnut, Greg O'Flynn, and said, you know, here's the wines. And you know, Greg said, you know, you make great Zinfandel. I'm glad to take them, but I want you guys to make white Zinfandel because you'd be really good at it. And Reed says, nah, that's not going to happen. Joel adamantly opposed to it. In fact, he has a sign over the fermenters that says no wimpy wines allowed.
Okay.
And he just made it up, you know, like, and it would have died there, except that, you know, Greg phones me up and he says, well, I'm coming up to the winery and want to taste your wines, want to see what you got coming up. I like your wines. He said, by the way, I want to see the sign. Sign. What sign's that, Greg? He says, well, you know, the one that says no wimpy wines over the fermenters. And I'm thinking, Reed's been there. Okay, sure. I phone up Reed and say, what's this about a sign? He says, oh, yeah, I thought he'd forget. I said, well, not only didn't he forget, but he's coming up. And he said, I guess we better have a sign made. So we had a sign made, so by the time Greg arrived, it was there. And, you know, that sign still hangs over the mantle here at the tasting room.
Right.
And it really described what we do. In those days, it did. In those days, we were making probably some of the biggest, most intensely flavored Zinfandels that were out there. You know, people have surpassed us in power. I don't think they've surpassed us in quality. But having said that, it was fun. And so we came up with a bumper sticker. Somebody said, oh, well, you couldn't put that bumper sticker on a car. It talks about wine. You know, it'd always been stopping me. So we came up with a Latin bumper sticker, which was Nullum Vinum Flaccidum, you know, which we thought was pretty funny. You know, really, once again, got the flavor of what we were about.
Sure.
And then we began looking for other languages. So we found Pas de Vin Coumouillé, which was the French version of, like, as no wet chicken wine. And perhaps the best was one of my field workers gave me. When I asked him, you know, what would this be in Mexican? And he said, oh, you never put this on a bumper sticker. And I said, well, give me a chance. And it was no vinos sin huevos.
Oh, see.
Yeah, meaning
I understand that one.
The best double pun ever, because, you know, no wines without eggs, you know, but it really means cajones, you know. But so you get the eggs and the cajones, the strong men, strong women. It's like, it's great. You know. So we have fun with that.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, Joe, thank you for your time. And
well, thank you.
Here's to 20 more years.
I'm all for it. Thank you.
Thank you.